Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, great to see you here. I'm Michael Lawrence. Good morning. Hope everybody's having a good day. And it's my enormous pleasure to welcome back to Asia House Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Finance Minister of Indonesia. As we know, Sri Mulyani has steered Indonesia's economy for the last decade. That period has been marked by strong growth, fiscal prudence, structural reform, an anti-corruption drive, all of which has made Indonesia one of the world's most attractive emerging markets and a destination for foreign investment. Sri Mulyani has also been at the forefront of Indonesia's commitment to sustainability and climate change, and she's a towering figure on the global stage. Indonesia is now going through a transition period following the election of Subianto Prabowo as the new president. He'll take over later in the year. So what does the future hold for Indonesia's economy during this transition period and beyond? That's going to be a key topic of conversation when the Finance Minister joins me on stage for a Q&A a little bit later. It's a real honour to have Sri Mulyani back at Asia House. She's now going to give us a briefing or an update on macroeconomic, fiscal and structural reform developments in Indonesia, after which we'll be in conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sri Mulyani.
Thank you, Michael, for a very generous introduction. It's good to be back here again. Very good morning to all of you, and good to be in ASEAN House and to provide you with the update on where we are today, and especially I'm sure many of you thinking about where Indonesia is going after the election, the new government, and the commitment that Indonesia being made and all the progress that we've been made, and how we are going to navigate the global environment, which is not easy. So let's start with this global environment. We do understand that globally the change in this geopolitics have the really significant implication. The world becoming fragmented. You talk about onshoring, offshoring, friendshoring, managing the engagement and so on. And that is just the word saying that the world globalization is becoming fragmented. And that's create huge implication for all emerging countries, especially for the Asia and especially for ASEAN and for Indonesia. Because this region has been actually reaped the benefit of globalization in the past 4 or 5 decades. Many of the progress being made in the ASEAN, China, +3, South Korea, Japan, they are all coming from this integration with the globalization and with the global economy. With this geopolitical tension, a lot of what you call it immediate short-term implication, for example, like the tension or war in Ukraine, now in the Middle East, they disrupted potentially or as already creating the disruption on supply chains. And that's can spike the commodity price, and for many countries which is open economy and relatively small, it hugely affecting their economy as well as the budget. Second one is also because of this high commodity price post-pandemic, creating a pressure on inflation, and that's why the policy adjustment by especially advanced countries, both in the United States, European, and here in UK, I think will create also another pressure for many developing emerging countries, responding by hiring interest rate in a very short time, in such a very speed, and now still higher for longer. It's like the vacuum cleaner, you actually taking many of the capital out from the emerging country. If you are not resilient enough, then those countries is going to be in a very serious difficulty. Higher for longer with higher interest rate, capital outflowing, foreign exchange movement, which is happening in the past April, that's is going to be one that need to be managed and watched very carefully. And certainly we also face with many of structural transformation and challenge. Climate change is already mentioned by Michael earlier. It's becoming one of the constant, and if I can recall, because Michael mentioned that I've been serving Minister of Finance for quite some time. I think in my past, this trip to London, from the annual meeting of the Islamic Development Bank, ADB, OECD, all my trip, we are talking about climate change and climate finance. So there is no finance ministry which cannot say anything but climate today. And that's become, at least for the Indonesia, is becoming an advantage. Because Indonesia is the one who actually initiated the meeting of the finance minister to discuss climate. That is back in 2013, when we were actually hosting the COP in Bali, UNFCCC. Since that, the tradition of Ministry of Finance and even now Central Bank talking about climate change become a trend. So we were a trendsetter at that time. And today, I think the discussion is becoming more and more technical about how this financing can be generated. Another issue that needs to be considered and always change as well as affecting the global economy, but also for many developing countries, is the digital technology with the artificial intelligence. And for the ASEAN, many of the ASEAN plus 3, in this case, Japan, South Korea, and China, aging population is becoming one of the most important. So these are all the environment in which we are operating. Never a dull moment. It's always like a challenge, new coming, but also something which is structural and fundamental. So that risk which is accumulated post-pandemic, creating the performance of the recovery of the global economy, not really in an encouraging level. Growth in the global economy is still stabilized but low, even though the inflation is already down, but still relatively high. And commodity price is starting adjusting last year and continue at the level of relatively adjusted level, which is low for Indonesia, meaning that this is going to affect our revenue on the budget. Manufacturing activity is also weak because of the global trade, which is weakening. Global manufacturing index, which is still at the expansion, but they are actually down to close to the 50, which is actually the borderline of the contraction. 47.8% PMI is in a red, that means in this case, contraction, and 52% of the PMI, which is measured, is in a expansion. Indonesia, if you look at the right side on the red curve, we continuously PMI always in an expansion. I think Indonesia and India is relatively in the two position, which is continue stable at the relatively good level. Even our neighboring country on ASEAN, they are suffering from this weakening global economy, weakening global trade, and also weakening their manufacturing activity. With that kind of environment, Indonesia has managed relatively well in navigating those risks. Our GDP growth is relatively stable at 5% in the past post the pandemic, but also before pandemic. So almost 1 decade Indonesia relatively in a 5%, even during the pandemic in which we are suffering from the negative growth, but we are only contracting by 2%. I think you are all seeing many countries is actually suffering much, much deeper contraction. And then immediately we have a V-shaped recovery and then steady at the 5%. Don't forget that this 5% is actually during those very turbulent environment. Interest rate high, geopolitical tension, disruption, commodity boom and bust. So this managing and maintaining 5% is not an easy. And it is because of both domestic factors that we try to maintain both on the demand side as well as on the production side. So we make sure that there is a transformation in the economy, that we are going to be more resilient from this global environment. And because the size of the Indonesia economy and domestic demand quite significant enough, we were able sometimes to withstand those external shocks. This is also contributed by the regional relatively performance evenly across big island in Indonesia. Java is for sure that we are continue growing around 5%. But you can also see Sumatra, which is now picking up, close to 5%. Bali, which is hard hit by the pandemic, is now recovering, close to even 6%. Kalimantan, which is the location of our new capital city, is also growing by above 5%. Sulawesi traditionally is the island with the very high good performance of growth, continue growing above 6 or even close to 7%. And Papua in this case is quite volatile, but relatively in a decent level. So these are all something. And if you can see Maluku with 14%, this is the small island close to the head of the bird of the Papua. This 14% alone is a growth which is contributing by the downstreaming industry, in which the investment on the downstream industry in Maluku contributing huge growth for those islands. With the growth which is relatively steady, unemployment and poverty also continued decrease. This is making sure that Indonesia is not only growth-oriented economy, but we also make sure that the inclusivity and equality is going to be there. We also manage inflation relatively well. I don't know about the UK economy, but I'm sure many of the advanced economy struggling from the high inflation, whether this is food inflation or energy inflation contributing. Indonesia is no exception, but if you look at the Indonesia inflation, maybe many of my colleagues from G7 even envy us. In the past, I envy them, now they envy us, because we are below 3% for quite some time, and this is something which is quite remarkable. What contributes Indonesia resiliency of the economy? Fiscal is certainly one thing, and I'm going to elaborate that because this is the area in which I'm in charge and responsible. But other than fiscal, the fiscal monetary mix for both central bank and Ministry of Finance working closely in order for us to be able to navigate huge shock like pandemic and now climate change, and also the structural transformation that we are having. The external balance is also contributing to this stability. Our current account, which traditionally become the Achilles heels for the Indonesia growth, now turn into a positive, and that's create ability for us to withstand, especially during the critical time in 2020 up to 2023 last year. Trade balance continue in a surplus, and that is also have something to do with the manufacturing and PMI, which is I explained earlier, always in expansion. Domestic demand is very important because Indonesia always have to balance between our source of growth coming from the external, but also maintaining a certain buffer so that the economy will continue relatively performing in a stable level and way. Consumer is going to be very important because household consumption is actually explaining more than 50% of our GDP. So that's why if you look at the consumer confidence, because of low inflation, relatively stable and high growth, that's we are seeing a consumer confidence which is relatively steady post the pandemic. We also see in this case PMI, which is expansion, and also the real estate, which is recovering after a little bit stagnant after the pandemic. Economy in Indonesia growing at the 5%, and Central Bureau Statistics just announcing 2 days ago, that we are in the first quarter of this year is continue growing at 5.11%. This is something which we are continue manage very carefully because the environment is changing very fast, and also fundamentally need to always continue a vigilant and policy response need to be continue prepared. I will now look at the update on the fiscal side. This is the area in which I'm in charge, of course, and that is the instrument of the policy which is important in protecting Indonesia economy and people from so many turbulence coming from outside, like pandemic or climate change, and also for us to continue our journey to become a high-income country. How to create development, growth, and equality. Let us look how the fiscal tools in action. If you look at the situation when we were facing with the pandemic, this is a test for all countries in the world. So this is a good comparison for all countries in the world. Indonesia, for the first time after 20 years, adopting a fiscal prudence in which we are not allowed to have a deficit more than 3% on our budget and not allowed to have a debt to GDP ratio above 60% of our GDP. But because of the extraordinary situation from this pandemic, we were relaxing those fiscal prudence with a lot of alarm. Because you know that when you open this Pandora box, politicians and all will love to have a big deficit because you borrow your future generation income for today's enjoyment. Is that right in this case? Yeah, I think so. So, for us, this deficit is something which is quite carefully need to be managed. Because of the pandemic has created totally halt on all activity, then we know that the revenue will drop. And our revenue actually dropped by 18% in 2020, and then in 2021 we start to recover. The question is how you are going to adjust. The spending can be cut, and in this case, it was actually quite ruthless for the Minister of Finance to say that everybody will be cut except for health and for the digital technology, because all schools now have to serve the education through the digital technology. So it's only two, which is exception to get the budget cut. Otherwise, all ministries, including the most powerful ministers, of course, they have to accept the cut of this budget. So you can imagine that during pandemic, maybe I'm the second two most unpopular after the COVID and ministries, Minister Sri Mulyani. But then with that, we were able to adjust relatively well by allowing to have the deficit more than 3%, and we end up designing from 6%. Now we are able to come up with only 5.7%. At that time, during this critical pandemic time, all countries expanding their fiscal deficit, I think including here in the United Kingdom. United States have 10% of deficit, and I still remember the cabinet discussion that we are having, some of the ministers asking, even United States, which is very powerful, they need to have deficit at 10% of GDP. So Indonesia should be 10%, and I said, okay, what do you want to use this 10% of? You are not going anywhere. We are all stay home. So you are not going to be able to spend anyway. The only one that we can spend is send money to the poor people which don't have a safety net, and also providing the health support. So that's the only thing which we could then negotiate, and we end up with the 6% of GDP. The first time after 25 years, Indonesia have a fiscal prudence, and then we end up with 5.7%. After that, we only provide 3 years allowing Indonesia to have deficit more than 3% of GDP. Some rating agency asking me at that time, I think I remember S&P asking me, Sri Mulyani, how do you know that the COVID is going to be over by 3 years and you are going to recover your deficit below 3% within 3 years? And I asked them, do you know about the COVID? Do you know when this is going to end? No, we don't. Same with me. So if you don't know, the only thing that we know that once you're relaxing this fiscal prudence, it will be difficult for you to return back. So that's why it is good for us to just give this announcement that we are going to have this relaxation of this prudential principle only 3 years. We do hope that this is going to be enough. But if it is not going to be enough, there need another political process to discuss about what is the situation 3 years from now. So that was like the case, and then Indonesia ended up that we were able to consolidate fiscal only 2 years. So after 5.7%, the following year, 2021, we have the deficit 4.8%, and then 2022, we've already returned to below 3%, 2.5%. So yay, I won. So I always like teasing my rating agency, all this stuff. Okay, I won the bet, so you have to upgrade my rating, I said. So that is how the fiscal work, and that is exactly how you always combine between ability and flexibility to respond to the change and shock, which is sometimes is just totally huge. But at the same time, you are not, in this case, lack of focus of managing the fundamental and credibility of your fiscal tools. Because this fiscal tool, like the budget, they are going to be the most important tools for any country. Once you lose credibility, once you lose the trust, it's going to be very difficult to return back. I'm not talking about your country here. I'm talking about the whole principle of the fiscal tools in this case. You all know very well that this fiscal management is very, very difficult because you always have a combination between political process, political conveniency, pressure on the social side, economic importance to build continuously the competitiveness, and at the same time you have to be continuous, sustainable, and credible. These are all a combination which is not really easy for any country. And for the small open economy like Indonesia, which is relatively small comparing to the world, although we are in a G20, and we also open, that means that we are vulnerable to many external shocks, it is going to be even multiply more difficult. So with that, Indonesia continue always responding to this shock, but at the same time, we continue also focusing on what is actually fundamentally important for the Indonesia economy. And if you look at the Indonesia economy, I think the fiscal tools has been quite a good bargain. Our deficit of 6.1% is preventing the contraction of the economy only at the 2.1%. If you compare with many other countries with a much deeper deficit, like what we see in here, United States end up with 14%, and they contracted by 2 points. UK here, you have the deficit of 13% of GDP, and yet your economy is still contracting by 13%. Other emerging countries, as you can see, that they have more a deeper deficit and much deeper also contraction of the economy. So if you look at the Indonesia, I think this is how we are always continue making sure, and especially this is not to show to the global, but more on our domestic audience. Because for Indonesia, really getting the political support in maintaining fiscal discipline is important, regardless who's governing and who's ruling the country. That is something that we should not sacrifice. And that's why this is something that we need to continue, maintain this tradition. And fiscal means that you have the revenue side, spending side, as well as the financing side. We continue reforming our tax. Indonesia is still among the lowest tax to GDP ratio. We continue investing in the institution as well as on a system, in this case, digital system. So now more than 96% of the Indonesia taxpayer paying tax digitally, so they don't have to go to the tax office. We also continue moving in terms of reforming the whole spending side, because we want to make sure that spending better and spending more effectively, so that we are going to be able to make sure that the fiscal tool is going to be also effective. So these are all the journey of the Indonesia. After shock, we're recovering, and we continue maintaining a good, credible instrument. Our budget 2024 today is also under a huge pressure. As I mentioned earlier, higher for longer foreign exchange, oil price, and commodity price, they are all changing quite dramatically in the past 3 years. And that's affecting both the revenue side as well as our spending side. On the revenue coming from both commodity-based economy as well as non-commodity-based is very important. We are transforming the economy from dominated in the past by the consumption into a more investment. We are also trying to make sure that there is more value added for many of the natural resource rates that Indonesia owns, including strategic mineral in this case. If you look at the priority of the budget to address the fundamentally issue important of the Indonesia economy, first, the quality of human capital. So health, education, social spending is very important. It's not about the how much you allocate, but the discussion more in a detail about how you are going to spend those allocated budget. Some of you maybe is already familiar, Indonesia has a mandatory by our constitution to spend 20% of our total budget for education. And that's why Indonesia were able now to establish what we call it the endowment for the education. If you can see that many of the Indonesians now attending many good university, and UK is among the top destination. That's why you can see that many of the Indonesia students now in Oxford, Cambridge, and many other, I can see that every time I walk now, every corner I see Indonesian. And they always say, Ibu, I got this scholarship from this endowment fund, which I initiated in 2010. So more than 500,000 domestic and abroad, but for abroad, we've already sent almost 6,000 people in UK, US, and so we actually generating a little bit revenue for the UK by this sending many of our students. Infrastructure is going to be important for Indonesia, and because Indonesia is an archipelago country, and we are still, in terms of the infrastructure index, we are lag behind. So toll road especially, we've built quite a lot, but we also have port, airport, electricity, and especially linking to the climate change is going to be one of the most vital one. Although now currently we've already built a lot of the power generating, but we want after 2030, every megawatt demand will be satisfied with 70% from renewable rather than from the non-renewable. That will require a huge investment on the grid as well as on the power generating. These are all the area that we are working with many of these ministry and local government in order to transform Indonesia economy to create more productivity-based growth and equal one. It's not easy, but I think this is the politically also right direction that we need to do. And for 2025, we will preparing the budget. This is Indonesia tradition of democratic transition. This government will end in October 20th. The budget discussion starting this May until October. So the one which is preparing the budget for the first year of the new government is going to be the outgoing government, and under, in this case, under my responsibility. So we are today is continuing discussing with many of this transition team and also managing on how this political transition will equal with this economic as well as fiscal transition, which is need to be smooth as well as safe for the Indonesia to continue our journey to become a prosperous Indonesia in 2045. In order for us to be able to become high-income country, we need to continue growing above around 6%, and that need to be contributed by productivity rather than perspiration. And that means investing in this human capital infrastructure and reforming our institution becoming one of the most important one. Indonesia is undergoing a lot of reform since the ASEAN financial crisis 97-98. Many of the legislations from the banking, non-bank capital market, including in this case competition policy, and also in reforming our fiscal management has been done since 1998. So when last week I was in Paris for the OECD ministerial meeting for the accession of the Indonesia membership of the OECD, many of what we've already built since 1999, 1998 was actually exactly the same foundation like the OECD country principle. So these are all just to make sure that Indonesia is going to continue this journey, cementing what we've already achieved in terms of building the right and strong foundation for the further growth. I'm going to maybe jump into the climate change. But before that, just to give you an update that many reform has already now implemented. Fiscal reform, including the tax reform, local government transfer, and financial sector reform. These are all the three very important reforms in which legislation is already passed. We are going to govern and improve the way we transfer our money to the local government. We also will continue deepening our reform on the taxation, and also on the financial sector reform, in which we are overhauling totally with the omnibus law of capital market, bank, non-bank, even carbon market is being introduced within this reform. So these are all a very important legislation, but the most important for now and in the future, the implementation of many of these legislation, which providing a very good foundation for Indonesia. Indonesia also actively playing at the global level in the G20, ASEAN, ASEAN Plus 3, and even on the APEC. These are all the forum which Indonesia also was asked regarding our position on the climate change. We've already announced national determined contribution. We even enhanced our determination to reduce the CO2 by 31% by our own and 42% with the international support. Biggest chunk of this national determined contribution is going to be on energy transition. The first, actually the most important also is the forestry and land use, because Indonesia have a tropical forest, but they are relatively cheap comparing to the energy transition. It will cost Indonesia $285 billion to actually deliver this NDC. And energy itself will require $260 billion. This will requiring more renewable, building more transmission and distribution, and reducing and using less fossil fuel. And for Indonesia, this is not an easy choice because we are rich in coal. We also have new gas which has been invented, exploration, and oil is still actually also have a contribution. So it is a good problem because it is a choice problem. But it will be very difficult if in this case, at the global level, the signaling of this climate change financing is not providing us with this ability to choose the right path. And that's why Indonesia has this energy transition mechanism country platform we announcing during the G20, in which we establish a management of the ETM, energy transition mechanism. During the G20, we also announced the JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership. 21 billion has been announced, but now we are working very closely with all the partners. 50% is private, 50% is public. We are working into the detail, what does it mean of this announcement to this transition of the Indonesia. So a lot of things happening in Indonesia, a lot of very important fundamental work has been built, a lot of achievement, but we know that this is just the beginning of our continued long journey. Not easy one, but we are very optimistic that Indonesia is going to be able to achieve our goal to become a high and prosperous, equal, inclusive country. Thank you so much.
So good to see you again, and thank you very much for being here. I know you've had an extraordinarily busy travel schedule, so thanks for coming to Asia House. There's a general assumption that you won't be part of the next government. That's the tone of your speech too. First question has to be, is that a reasonable working assumption?
Some of you looks very surprised, so I also surprised with this question. No, but serious answer, Indonesia is a presidential system within our politics. So the new elected president has been decided. So I think this is going to be a very critical and important transition. The new elected president and the vice president, they actually continue communicating that they will bring continuity. So we are hoping that many of these fundamentals that we've already discussed earlier is going to be continued, but at the same time also improving. So continuity with the improvement, I think that's important. Regarding the cabinet, unfortunately, Michael, I cannot answer that question because that is only the president who knows who's going to be in the cabinet. So your aspirations should be conveyed to the right person, not to the wrong person.
Thank you very much. What's the key message you would give to any incoming folks? Is it fiscal prudence? You said do not sacrifice fiscal prudence, something along those lines. Is that the number one message for any incoming finance minister?
Well, I think all the political parties recognize in order for us, Indonesia, to continue this journey, you really need to continue maintaining the good foundation. And that's good, because this is not about one person, but shared by all important parties in Indonesia. Indonesia is not like in the UK politics in which you only have two parties. Fortunately, we have more than two parties. I said fortunately, because we have at least 8 big elected parties which is sitting in the parliament. And this provides us with quite a lot of, in this case, political discussion, but also at the same time, we have the ability to juggle on this kind. But on the fiscal prudence, I think they are all more or less share that this principle should not be sacrificed. And market is also a good providing signal. So the new government is already receiving the signal that the market want Indonesia to continue with this fiscal prudence. So I think now the transition team has been managing and seeing and listening to all this signal. And I'm sure within the 2025, as I said earlier, that we are in charge of preparing the budget for the first year of this government. That signal will continue to be conveyed.
You are preparing the budget for next year, and you spoke very clearly about the external issues. It's the most challenging external environment I think I've seen in a long, long time, if not ever. What's the biggest external risk? Is it the strength of the dollar and US interest rates? Is it the conflicts that are going on? Again, as you frame your budget.
Well, the exchange rates movement or dollar strengthening in this case is definitely have a more immediate impact, because you every day will see in terms of our revenue, which is some of them in dollar. That means strengthening dollar in rupiah denomination, we have more rupiah. But we also have the spending which is based on dollar also in this case, like our subsidy and so on. So we really need to look at this balance, because the impact is immediate. The second one is also on the interest rate. This higher for longer. I mean, Federal Reserve Chairman Powell increasing the interest rate only less than 18 months by more than 500 basis points, 5.25, 5.5%. Indonesia, our yield of our bonds, 10 years, is actually relatively steady, both the US and local currency. So our spread with the US is now has been tightened to the lowest in the history, only 230 basis points. And that's why this is a good achievement, because many of bondholders, and by the way, I'm here because I'm going to see many of these important bondholders, they're going to still continue to see Indonesia as a good investment place. But certainly the pressure at comparing the risk return is going to be there. So for us, again, this US strengthening interest rate higher for longer is going to have a more immediate impact. But if you ask about what is going to be like the big game changer, geopolitics and climate change. Yep. Oh, and then digital, the artificial intelligence. I actually just received that people can really replace me with an AI, which is, I think, is good. So you don't need Sri Mulyani. You can have AI. So that's going to be quite a game changer, I think.
And you and the central bank, you and Pak Perry, work very closely together. And you make a feature of that. He's spoken to us about it, and so have you. You talked about it there. Again, is that a policy you would advise that continues into this next government?
Well, central bank is an independent since 97, 98, when Indonesia have the banking and economic crisis. A lot of governance and fundamental of the way we establish our institutions changed quite dramatically. One is the independency of the central bank. So central bank have their own cycle, and this current central bank governor has been re-elected for the second term. That means there will be a continuity on the monetary side.
I want to get on to e-commerce, and the digital transformation in Indonesia has been breathtaking. But the moratorium on tax, by the way, was extended by another 2 years at the last WTO meeting. You've opposed that. Again, looking out in a couple of years, do you see that changing, and what sort of impact will that have on revenue generation in Indonesia?
Well, on this moratorium, it's not actually related to the revenue, because it's not generating revenue in a way. But I think all countries in the world should recognize that the world will be governed and will be actually affected by this digital technology fundamentally, including the trade between countries, movement of the people, capital, and so on. So within our law of the customs, we actually recognize that the flow of goods and services is not only in the form of this just the real thing, but also on a digital thing. And that's why we said that it will be very good for the global, including WTO, to recognize that digital movement, whether this is on services, I think Indonesia more and more now enjoying the movie streaming from the company. I don't have to name the name of the company because it will be seen as endorsing. But I mean, that is exactly the fact of life. I mean, song, movie, and even payment system and so on. So this will create quite a fundamental question for a country, any country in the world. Do we have any control? Or if we want to control, what do you want to control? What is the purpose of each economy? What is this landscape change and fundamental change will affect our ability to achieve our goals? Because all countries not in the same level. Some countries still lag behind, fragile, low and lowest least developed, other low income country, other middle income country, other in a more advanced country. But all countries will be affected by this one. And for country which is lag behind, it's going to be even more difficult to catch up when you are not putting the fair level playing field. So that is a little bit long answer, but it is not about revenue. It is about recognizing that the digital technology is become one that need to be put into consideration how you design the right policy and just policy across country.
You've led the climate change agenda in Indonesia, and you've been very passionate about the provision of green finance. In fact, Indonesia, I think, was one of the first to Asia to issue a green bond. Is there momentum? Is there a risk that we'll lose momentum, not only in the new government, but given the various geopolitical risks that everyone is facing at the moment?
Well, as a finance minister, we also try to continue improving and diversifying our instrument. In this case, since 2008, 2009, Indonesia continue actually building the diversifying our financing instrument from the conventional into the Sharia base, from the conventional to the sukuk, to the green base. And also this is combining these two because we know that the appetite to invest in Indonesia with our reputation getting stronger and better, there is a lot of appetite not only in European, especially London-based, but also United States, Asia, Middle East. So green instrument like the green bonds is already issued, and I think now total more than 8 billion or 6 billion that we've issued. And here we actually mostly also issuing in here. So London, regardless what your situation, still actually being seen as a good financial center. Discussion among the finance minister in the last meeting, in spring meeting in Washington, D.C., saying that issuing green bond is not giving you a green premium, meaning that either you are green or conventional, the investor is just price you and provide you with the same yield. So it's actually market fail on recognizing while the green bond require a compliance which is much more quite costly. Because you really have to show that this is the underlying activity or program is actually consistent with this label of green. So the market is not yet providing this kind of recognition. In terms of volume, I think this is just an instrument, meaning that Indonesia need to look at the need of this transition, and we look at the need which is going to be huge, 285 billion US dollar. In the environment of the higher interest rate for longer, it will be even more expensive. So affordability to finance this transition is going to be a big question mark. We discuss a lot with a lot of multilateral development bank, World Bank, ADB, AIIB, even Islamic Development Bank, how they are going to actually finance, because almost all their president of these MDBs saying that we are going to finance more climate change. So we discuss about whether their structure of financing it makes sense. And by the way, Michael, just for your information, the price of many of this MDB is now much more expensive than I issue my bonds for the market. So that's also becoming, when they issue, it's going to be something which is, when you talk about the cost of borrowing and cost of capital, this is something which is totally different for Indonesia. So it's a good problem to have, but it is really changing quite a lot. I remember I was finance minister like 10 years ago, and Indonesia, when issue our bond, is still higher than the MDB can over us. Now it's the other way around. So it is, the price of capital becoming very important, program important, instrument is very important. But we work very, very closely with other stakeholders. Blended finance, Indonesia is already announcing it. We are also, in this case, working very closely with philanthropy as well as the private sector. Yeah.
Another big issue for the climate agenda is carbon pricing and carbon markets. There are a patchwork of carbon markets around the world at the moment. None of them seem to have be harmonized in any way, shape or form. How big a challenge is that, and how important is that to delivering net zero goals?
Well, I think theoretically it's very important. You talk about climate change, which is not only Indonesia or UK or Fiji Island or United States facing. This is global problem. So you talk about global public goods or global public bad, whatever you call it. So you talk about this global public commodity that is the CO2 emission, regardless where you are going to like emit, but they are creating this choking for this world. So you talk about one commodity which is the same, CO2, which is bad, but you don't have the market, or at least you don't have the integrated market globally. I remember in the G20, my colleague Christia from Canada, the Minister of Finance, saying that the price of carbon in Canada, if you are going to achieve this 1.5% avoiding the increasing temperature of the world, it should be at the level of 175 Canadian dollar. In the United States, I don't know about the price of the carbon over there. Maybe there is no carbon market yet. There is a voluntary. In European, at some point they have 75 down to 25, so it's like very volatile. Singapore, our neighboring country, is starting to have the carbon market. They start with a price of $4.
Yeah.
Indonesia start with the $2. So you can imagine, if this is like global trade, the people from here who say that the carbon should be priced at, let's say, $75, and in Indonesia you can buy with $2, why don't we just buy this? And that's why the discussion about the carbon leak and how you are going to make sure that this national determined contribution. I think a lot of work now on this carbon market is going to be one of the most important attention in many of the discussions that we are having. And yes, it will require a lot of thinking, fundamental arrangement and governance. Yeah.
I want to give some time for the audience to ask you questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure. As long as not a difficult question.
Just hand in the AI couldn't answer the questions we're going to ask, I promise you. I'll come to Noel Kluhane in just a moment to ask the first question, but one more from me. The aspiration to join the OECD, long-term aspiration, I assume it parallels the 2045 vision for Indonesia. Talks have started. Is it realistic? What sense do you get from the OECD? Are they enthusiastic about your joining the group?
Very, very enthusiastic, especially the Secretary General, Matthias, not because he's Australian and he wants to have his big neighbor to be in a club. But I think strategically OECD should really, if you become a club, which is unfortunately the name is like a rich club, which is, I think that's a misnomer. It's more like a like-minded governance based on the market. And I think that is really needed and important for many countries to be able to actually then integrate with this global economy. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, geopolitical situation today is becoming fragmented. But the like-minded country which agree that the market mechanism and open market competitive is important for your economy, I think that's important. And that's why for the OECD to know and see Indonesia would like to join, And that's will strengthening our many of this fundamental reform that I've already explained to you all. It's not something, this is voluntarily, and there is a mutual feeling of for OECD is going to be good, and for Indonesia is also good. And then after Indonesia announcing our accession process with the OECD, now the Thailand is also starting to apply. So it's good to have.
It's starting a movement.
Yeah.
Right. Let's go to Noel Kluhane Noel, and then Natasha will come to you after. Okay.
Thank you, Minister, for your remarks. Noel Kluhane from BDO and various ASEAN business councils. I have a particular question for you about some of President Jacobi's signature policies, which were the banning of the export of particular products, including palm oil at one stage, but more enduringly nickel, of which you have the largest reserves in the world. That seemed like a success in terms of the downstreaming effect, creating refining and manufacturing batteries in Indonesia, but maybe not a long-term strategy because batteries are increasingly made with lithium instead of nickel. So I'd love to get your thoughts on whether Indonesia will persist with that policy. Thank you.
Well, Indonesia is comply with many of this, and we are hoping that the market mechanism will solve our problem, which is not, it's actually not happening. So sometimes you really need a little bit, what you call it, industrial policy, which is now becoming a fashion to many countries, talking about the industrial policy. I mean, the approach of the Indonesia is a combination between improving our business climate, and that's why we have this omnibus law on ease of doing business in Indonesia. We call it job creation, in which we simplify many of our regulatory policy in labor, environment, investment, as well as small, medium enterprises. All those things has been overhauled. What is the objective? Is actually for the investor come to Indonesia and feel that, oh, okay, this is a good place to do and make sense, and I understand the regulation, so I will invest in here. On the other hand, investors sometimes need to be convinced about, okay, we export quite a lot of, including the strategic mineral. And this is not just yesterday. It's been like 60 decades or even 70 decades since Indonesia independent. Sometime in my conversation with some of the big company, and I said, you promised to build the smelter in Indonesia. That promise back in 1990 and never delivered that. Why is that? Oh, because smelter is so expensive, Sri Mulyani. You need to know what you want. And why? Well, because this is so risky and need a lot of capital. But then why you open smelter in my neighboring country, although they don't have those raw material? What is the difference between Indonesia and our neighboring country? They cannot answer. So that means decision by business sometimes need to be nudge. You have this nudge, right? The book which is very popular. So this is the way that the Indonesia try to nudge this decision in order for us to be able to convince. But it is not just forcing that you have to invest in Indonesia and then you exploit them, but we provide you with the best investment climate, and now you have to invest in Indonesia. So it is like a win-win. And don't forget, as I mentioned earlier, with those kind of value added, which is now happening in almost all, not only the strategic mineral, but almost all mineral in Indonesia, it contributes to the stability of Indonesia economy. Indonesia economy is stable and continue growing high, it will provide benefit for the region and the world. So I think that is the good game. In a way that this is what we are doing now, that we recognize that a lot of value added of many of this industry in Indonesia should and could be done. Within the context of the electric vehicle, battery technology and so on, I think this is continue moving, and Indonesia watching very carefully as well as discussing with many parties in order for us to be able to position in the right policy and place for this kind of continued dynamic changing.
Natasha Shu now from HSBC, and after Natasha, Dasuki will come to you.
Thank you, Minister. Having myself lived in Indonesia during the 97-98 financial crisis, I appreciate that Indonesia's economic stability was hard won, and it's amazing to see that Indonesia is now on course to be the world's 4th largest economy within, I think it's 20 years. What are some of the main factors, do you think, that may impede that goal? And indeed, do you think it can be met sooner?
Well, I think the crisis is very changing Indonesia really a lot and fundamentally. It is not only in the form of the cost of this banking crisis, which may be among the most expensive bailout in the world. I think we are only compared with Argentina maybe, because it's almost 80% of our GDP in bailing out this banking system. But it was really a very deep fundamental crisis for Indonesia. The crisis for the government, the trust is lacking or gone. The crisis in terms of the way we govern politically in Indonesia, and that's why we become, although Indonesia is actually a democratic system, we always have 5 years election. But then we say that it should be a real democracy, which is not going to be, know who's going to win any election. In the past, we always know who's going to be the president, even before the election. So I think that's, and then we have a huge fundamentally change in terms of our legislation. As I mentioned earlier, even in the economic front, and that's credit to President Habibie at that time, that he's actually passing more than 300 legislation, as I mentioned earlier, bankruptcy law, competition law, Bank Indonesia independence, state finance laws, treasury law, banking law. There are so many laws which is actually being passed, and that's become a fundamental for Indonesia. But passing law is actually one thing. We have the Anti-Corruption Commission established during that, and that's become also a momentum for us. For me, immediately as a finance minister 2005, that is really an opening and momentum to build the governance, cleaning up from the corruption, building the capacity of our staff, creating transparency. I don't know about the UK, but is there any in this UK that the Minister of Finance every month going to the public, explaining about how much I collect, how much I spend, how much debt I issue every month, not only once a year when you go to the parliament. This is just to show the transparency, accountability become one of the foundation for this democratic, which is also healthy for Indonesia. So yeah, I think the most ingredient is that crisis provide us with a totally change in terms of the way we govern the economy, and also politically synchronized on a more opening democratic system.
Dasuki Shitani now from Mitsui.
Thank you, Minister. I'm from Mitsui. I have one question regarding to the capital relocation. What is the most challenging tasks from the point of view of fiscal policy of Indonesia? Thank you.
The capital what?
Capital relocation to the Kalimantan.
To Kalimantan.
Yeah.
Oh, the capital relocation. The new capital city has been built, and why Kalimantan? Well, in the past, the first president said that Indonesia should have the capital in Kalimantan. That's one thing. The second one, from the geographic point of view, it is really in the middle of Indonesia. The third one, as a finance minister, I think I have quite a unique answer for that. I've been actually quite struggle in how we are going to create a new source of growth for especially many islands in Indonesia. If you look at the composition of the revenue and economy, even if the mining is in Papua or in Kalimantan or in Sulawesi, the headquarters of all those corporations is always in Jakarta. So the revenue is really looks like Jakarta-based, but actually the activity is on the outer island. And then you cannot really, as much as you try to design the transfer of the government finance to the local government, it will not create this kind of the new source of growth. So I think in a way, not only symbolically, but also in terms of the economic activity, this new capital city in Kalimantan will provide the Kalimantan to grow at the level what they deserve. To be very honest, Kalimantan is always growing very low, while their natural resources has been actually being moved to Java Island, which is more heavily populated. So this is going to be a good, and if I can add you with more perspective, Sumatra, which is like the biggest island on the western side, close to Singapore and Malaysia, we built the toll road north to south. And actually, the amount of capital or spending to build this toll road is much expensive than this new capital, but everybody looking at this new capital. But this toll road is going to change Sumatra quite a lot because they are the one who also natural resource rich, they're quite diversified. Proximity to the Singapore, Malaysia is very logical to have a much more bigger and vibrant economy. So in a way, Indonesia need to have source of growth which is beyond Jakarta or Java. And that's good. Not only just a rhetoric politically, but also moving and investing in a significant way.
Tara Delenda from Haleon.
It's a related question to trade, but on the import restrictions side of things, just would be interested in understanding what you see the outlook with regard to the current quota systems, whether there may be opportunity to negotiate them not just on an annual basis, but on a 3 and 5 year basis, and to give more, I suppose, stability to businesses. And then just on the other side of that, just with regard to then investment and how restricting raw material imports might actually impact the outside exporting side of things, just where you feel that might be going?
Well, ideally, if you talk as an economist talking about the global trade and so on, trade is supposed to be a win-win in this case, whether you're talking about export and import. But we also can see that many countries becoming industrial not because of the pure market mechanism. There is always a government support, or in this case policy, that is allowing that first forces. I think the combination is more like how you are going to combine the discipline of the market forces that will allow you to then operate in a more efficient, good governed way, vis-a-vis, as I said earlier, a nudge that needs to actually create more value added. So it is, I think, that kind of experience which also inspire us and see, for example, if you look from Japan, even South Korea, or even China, you can see this is not pure just market mechanism to become an industrial. You always have a certain policy. So yes, from the point of view that it will affect the supply chains in the other destination, but for a big country like Indonesia to be able to have a more value added, becoming more industrial, becoming middle, higher, or even higher income country, I think this is going to be a good for the global economy. Now Indonesia has become a destination of many, and having a middle class Indonesia, we are traveling a lot. We are going to UK, we are going to Europe, and so I think this is just a strategy which we know that it will be totally orthodox and conventional, but sometimes you have to do it, but not in an excessive, so that you are going to totally abandon the market discipline. So a combination between two is still needed. There is a certain discretion, but also market discipline.
I'm afraid we are out of time. We could easily go on another couple of hours, and I'd very much like to, but I know you have a very busy schedule. Sri Mulyani, I can't thank you enough for being here. You've clearly laid the foundations for a very bright future in Indonesia. I mean, the change in Indonesia over the 10 years you've been finance minister has been truly breathtaking, so many congratulations for that. Good luck with the next 6 or 8 months, because it's a very turbulent time, and I'm sure that you'll put in place the budget that will enable the new government to have a flying start. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking you.